everybody, and welcome to tonight's edition of Liberty Action Network TV. I'm your host, Doreen Finkel, and tonight we are going to be talking about immigration, security, financial issues, the IRS, and you name it. We have Dr. Murray Sabrin from Ramapo College with us. Welcome. Dave Corsi from American Fair Tax. Dr. Michael Zay from Montclair State University, and Dr. Fernando Uribe, also from the Uribe Society and Hudson County TV. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let's start with the IRS scandal first, and let's go to you, Dr. Sabrin.
Sure.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, this is another example of why the proponents of the income tax, when it was debated well over 100 years ago, said that this was not going to be an intrusive organization, the Internal Revenue Service. And taxes were supposed to be very low. In fact, 98% of the American people were exempt from the first income tax. And the critics of the income tax amendment over 100 years ago said, no, this is going to be a very abusive system imposed on the American people, an income tax. And they said this was going to cause the IRS to go into our personal records, that we would have to demonstrate that we comply with the tax code by keeping all these records, which is a burden on the average person and American businesses. And that's why people have always opposed the income tax, who felt that this was a gross violation of civil liberties and was going to harm the U.S. economy. And now, nearly 100 years later, since the income tax was passed, we see the abuses of the IRS because tax-exempt organizations have to go through hoops in order to get permission from the IRS to be tax-exempt. And so my perspective is very simple. We should get rid of the income tax, and this way it would solve all the problems of abuses, that we'd have to keep all these records. It would be a lifting of this dead weight on the U.S. economy, which some economists have estimated years ago of costing us $600 billion. That's probably well over $1 trillion today of lost output that we could have instead of the IRS and the federal government making us pay these enormous taxes. So as the author of a book who called for the elimination of all taxes, it would be wonderful if the American people now rise up and say, enough is enough, let's get rid of the income tax, let's go to a free society, which is what we were supposed to have 200 years ago. And if we did that, I think our economy would bloom. We wouldn't need the Federal Reserve to create all this funny money, and we would finally have more personal freedom and economic freedom.
And go ahead, Dave.
Okay. As a representative of New Jersey Fair Tax, obviously we have been against the current tax code for quite a while now. We believe there has to be a change because ultimately, if we don't change our tax code, it will destroy this nation. Mathematically, there is no way under the income tax that we can fund and actually pay down our debt. So we have to think about changing. And the only reason we have the current code, as Murray alluded to with all the abuses, is so politicians can control us. It's a national disgrace, our tax code. Nobody in their right mind would take our current tax code and put it on any other nation. And every day that we allow it to be on us, we are in fact voting to keep ourselves enslaved to politicians. We have to make that change.
Go ahead, Dr. Zay.
Yeah, there's something that I find really disturbing about the way that this was carried out, the IRS intrusion into, and I think it's something that as we tear the various layers, we're going to find out that it goes higher up and it goes deeper. I think that this is something that it has been abused, that has been practiced for years now, and I think we're at a tipping point. And what I find really disturbing, we really have two choices here. One of them is to ignore this, slap a few wrists, and say it was just lower level people carrying this out. And the other one is to actually get to the bottom of the issue itself. If we don't get to the bottom, and if there is not real punitive measures taken against the people who did this, we are going to establish a template for every administration from here on in to use the same practices of intimidation and intrusion into people's private lives. We actually we have no choice at this point, regardless of what one's ideology. We essentially have to face this. It's probably one of the most critical issues that has emerged over the last few years.
I can say, because I'm the New Jersey State Tea Party student recruit and also head of campus tea parties, and we are a 501c3, both groups, Tea Party students and this, and I can say that the IRS has asked us for a Facebook and the radio show and have done some things that we've had to answer for. But go ahead, Dr. Uribe.
Well, Doreen, and again, all the panelists here have given great points. I'll add one more. Again, when we look at the IRS, we look at nothing more than just an arm of the federal government. It's been a political weapon that's been used by both parties. Let's be honest here. It's been used by both parties. But what makes it even more disgraceful about, especially what we're hearing about today, is that this is the same agency that we're hearing about all of these allegations. And again, even today was reported that the Inspector General is continuing to investigate this. And we'll see how deep this really runs and how far up in the administration it goes. But ultimately, what's even more of a concern for me is that this is the same federal agency that will now, starting in 2014, will be administering the Affordable Health Care Act, known as Obamacare. So if we can't trust them to act responsibly and ethically with who they're monitoring, who they're trying to investigate, can we really expect the same agency to be able to implement the Affordable Health Care Act next year honestly and legally? I don't think so. And this is just I would just say the small little piece of the iceberg right now, because we're going to be seeing this being blown up. And the fact that the liberal mainstream media is now even really examining it is really a testimony to them, because let's be honest, the liberal media has really been asleep the last 5 years with this administration. Now the fact that they're taking President Obama and everyone else in his administration to task on this is going to, again, heads are going to roll soon, and we'll see what the findings are with the Inspector General.
Has any of you taken note of the liberal media response to this, or?
Not that in particular, but I also think a point is now with the AP, the story in the AP, that the Obama administration has been kind of confiscating their records. Suddenly the honeymoon between the Obama administration and the mainstream media may be coming to an end when they realize that they have been looked into. So it may take the kid gloves off.
I just wanted to make the point, to reinforce that if the mainstream media does not at least have very vocal opposition and not only vocal opposition, but investigative reports into all levels of this, they are basically establishing the conditions for this to happen again, because you either approve this or you investigate it. There doesn't seem to be any middle ground here. And if you don't investigate, you can have no complaints 4 years from now when maybe a less friendly administration, or an administration that you're less friendly to, uses the same techniques. It basically, do we give tacit approval to this? And we're all basically on call at this point, and the media is as much responsible at this point for at least voicing opposition.
Right.
If I could just add real quick, and to his point, I mean, the mainstream media has been a willing accomplice of this administration in terms of not really investigating it the way it should have, even when President Obama was candidate Obama. And now, as to their point, that the honeymoon, I think, is starting to end. And now whether or not the mainstream media is going to keep on this persistence and they're going to keep the heat on the press secretary, Jay Carney, today, who, again, I've never seen this guy sweat. You would think he was in a sauna today, the way he was sweating up there. But, credit those reporters today for finally having, as we say, the political set to go up there and really grill him about where this administration stands with this, because this is not going away. The Benghazi thing has, I wouldn't say been dying, to use a bad term, but has been dying in the news cycle. We all know Fast and Furious died a very, very quick death in the news cycle. I think this is gathering legs here, and I think this is going to stick around for a while. This could haunt the administration, and as we all know, in the second term, could this be a part of the second term curse for any president? We'll see, but right now it's looking really bleak for President Obama.
It's also the hypocrisy, because they went after the mainstream when Rupert Murdoch and News Corporation did it in England. They took them to task, and rightfully so. So now, how can they went after them so strongly and now say, well, when they were being investigated, that it's okay? I agree with you. I think it's going to have legs to it.
And let's turn to the security on the border and the drone issue. Speaking of government. And some say that it's effectively doing its job. It's stopping the drugs from coming across the border and catching illegals. But others are saying, well, the program is too expensive and it's being misused. And so let's go to Dr. Sabrin first.
Well, drones are just typical or symptomatic, if you will, of big government running amok. That we've used drones in the Mideast. Innocent people have been killed at wedding parties and in their villages. This is not exactly what builds goodwill toward America in the Mideast. And of course, we shouldn't be there in the first place, but that's another issue. But drones on the border is another example of how politicians create a problem and then try to solve it with even a greater problem, is using drones, which is it'll kill innocent people on the border. And yet we wring our hands, rightfully so, when innocent children and teachers are killed in Newtown, Connecticut, when it seems when innocent people are killed in the Mideast, we sort of say, well, that's collateral damage. And so we have really a moral relativism in our country that is really disturbing, because if people can be so blasé about the deaths of innocent people overseas, and only American deaths are valuable, that sends a message to the rest of the world that life overseas is not worth much to the American government. And then you can understand why people are upset with the American government. It's not the American people that they're upset with the American government. And as far as the border goes, clearly nations have to control their borders for no other reason than for pragmatic reasons. We don't want people coming across the border who are criminals or have bad intentions, or they may be diseased. People from third world countries tend to not have as good health conditions as Americans do. So we want to make sure that people come in. Remember that great scene in The Godfather when Vito Corleone came to America? He was isolated because he had tuberculosis coming through Ellis Island. That's what typically happened to immigrants 100 years ago. They were quarantined because they were carrying illnesses, and tuberculosis was a major illness of peasants coming from Italy and Ireland, East Europe, and countries like that. So the thing that really frightens me about what's going on in Washington today is that they're going to use every police state tactic to control what they've created, which is a big mess with this welfare warfare state. And the border issue is just another way for them saying to the American people, hey, look, we're doing something for you, and what they're doing is basically violating our civil liberties, because these drones don't know if you're a friendly or a non-friendly. Someone's got to pull the trigger in some isolated location, so they don't know if that person is coming across the border legally or illegally.
Right, and would you say a better way to control the immigration would be to pass the law instead of using this kind of stuff?
Well, the problem with the immigration laws as we have them on the books today is that they really don't mean anything, because no nation that I'm aware of has open immigration, that anyone can walk into a country and stay there and as long as they want.
The U.S. does.
Yeah. But having said that, if we believe in freedom, if we believe in people have the right to travel, the way we solve this problem is, one, if companies want workers, they should invite them in from wherever they live. Whether if a company in New Jersey wants a worker from Texas, that's perfectly legal. But if they come from Mexico, that seems to be illegal. Remember, these borders are just arbitrary arrangements that governments have created. There's nothing natural about them. We travel from New York to New Jersey to New York or Pennsylvania. You don't know you're going to a different state, because the only reason you know is because the sign says "Welcome to New York" or "Welcome to Pennsylvania." So borders are really lines on the topography that governments have created. So there's nothing natural about them. So we don't need permission to travel overseas, except we just came back from Cuba in January. We were in Cuba for a week, but we needed special permission. You need a license to go to Cuba. Now, in a free society, you don't need a license from the government to travel anywhere. And if people want to come to work in the United States because an employer has invited them, that should be perfectly legal in a free society.
Go ahead, Dave.
Well, I find the problem is, first off, Congress has no will to control the borders, whether it's for political or economic reasons. They refuse to do what it calls for in the Constitution. I believe control of the borders is part of our national defense. However, what amazes me is Congress will tell you, or want to pass laws, or the politicians, about what kind of car you can drive, how much soda you can drink, what kind of health care you will be allowed to have. But when it comes to something that is actually written in there for common defense, they drop the ball. I personally believe a lot of it has to do with Social Security. That's why both groups bandied together about doing the pathway to citizenship, which might or might not be a good idea, but as Murray alluded to, until you have control of your borders, the laws are meaningless. Until we get to that point, passing a law is just giving lip service to the problem.
I agree with both my colleagues here in regard to this issue, and I just wanted to say a few things about drones. First of all, drones are mechanical apparati. I mean, they're up there. As far as we know, they can watch, but they can't do much of anything else. They can bomb, but we're not going to be shooting at people, we think, coming across the border. So basically, they're watching. Now, if you look at the immigration bill, they've allocated money for watching drones, but the drones are not backed up by real surveillance. They're involved in surveillance, but actually catching people, these drones are actually useless. And they've only added about 3,000 Border Patrol people to the 16,000 that we have at this point. So they're really not expanding the number of people it would take to prevent people that you're watching with a drone. And there are other electronic mechanisms that one can utilize. One of the things that bothers me about the drone issue is that first they will watch people, then they will start following people into Arizona, into Texas, into New Mexico, and suddenly we will have drones over American soil. And this will be an entry point for the use of drones, which are highly controversial. And I just want to mention one other thing, and people don't realize this. Drones are based on wireless technology. It can be hacked. There was a drone that supposedly crashed in Iran about a year and a half ago, and there have been a few incidents like this. And if one reads the technical literature, there's a suggestion that these were hacked and redirected by the Iranians themselves. They basically took control of these machines. So we have to remember, with these drones up there, they don't necessarily follow the will of the owner. They can be hacked, they can be redirected, and I would hate to think that these are going to be used for nefarious reasons by someone who takes control of them. So I think this is a technological issue which I don't think, first of all, I don't think Congress is really able to handle a lot of these technology issues, especially when you talk about computers. I don't think they understand what the technology is and what it can do.
Go ahead.
Again, my colleagues all hit out of the ballpark with their points, and I'll add one more. Watching Senator Rand Paul in that filibuster a couple months back was very inspiring, seeing him go before Congress and even talk about drones and everything like that. What concerns me mostly about the usage of drones over American soil, and he hit it right on the head about just technology. We live in such a technology-driven society now, not just because of globalization. Again, the world has become smaller, and when we look at the risks of technology, it could ultimately cripple us. And we're looking at something like drones where it could be very problematic for civil liberties and also just for public safety. And I'll add one more thing here. Since we were talking about immigration and the issue about it, has there ever been a more hypocritical country in regards to immigration than our neighbors to the south, such as Mexico? Mm-hmm. Mexico has the toughest, most strict immigration policies in the Americas, maybe in the world. And I've always found it funny.
Do they harm you if you come across the border there?
Not necessarily harm you, but I mean, but their deportation policy is roughly within 30 days. So if you're in the country illegally and they do find you to be there illegally, they'll deport you within 30 days or less. I mean, they're very expeditious in that way. And meanwhile, I've always found it funny that their government, whether it was Vicente Fox back from 2005, 2006 till even the newer president, has always sort of demonized American immigration policy as, well, we're not compassionate enough. I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, I really found it to be very humorous. But, again, immigration is a really complicated issue because Congress, again, fails, as Dave mentioned before, fails to simply protect our own sovereignty, which is right in our Constitution. And what's even more disgraceful is the fact that it's a great political weapon come election time. But once an election goes by, whether it's a congressional election or whether it's a presidential election, immigration reform may stay on the surface, within the news cycle, but it slowly disappears. And that's what's happening right now, because again, we're seeing the issues we mentioned before about Benghazi, about the IRS scandal now. And again, the way it's looking with this administration, we can have a brand new scandal next week. So again, until Congress really keeps this right in the forefront, it's going to, again, disappear. And it may not reappear again either until next year during the congressional elections or even 2016.
Are the liberals united with the conservatives on the drone issue? Or there's just no coming
They
together?
were, well, the liberal press that I saw, the liberal media was condemning Rand Paul for his grandstanding, and they wouldn't deal with the issue. And I was asking myself, it's kind of interesting. The left has evolved over the last 40 years. The left that I knew, going back to the 60s and 70s, was essentially, in a lot of ways, libertarian. And they were against government control. They didn't trust the federal government. They didn't trust the IRS. They didn't trust the FBI. Something has changed. Maybe it's because they're in power at this point, but suddenly anyone who questions drones in the sky becomes painted as almost a fanatic and someone who is dealing with a very trivial issue. And that was the reaction I saw in the Huffington Post and all of the other kind of left-leaning liberal journals.
Right. I mean, it just seems as though we need a Congress that works together, not,
Don't hold your breath on that.
Well, they do work together. They're creating a police state. That's the real problem. This E-Verify that Senator McCain and Senator Schumer want to implement, where workers would have to prove that they are here legally, not just immigrants, but everyone who's currently working would have to have an E-Verify
That's
card.
the only way it could work. I mean, you can't just pick up, they're not going to announce that they're illegal and here, check my card. I mean, it would have to be everything.
So that means that every 130 some odd million Americans who are working will have to be get a government-approved card that they're here illegally and they're allowed to work. So this is another example of the government failing to exercise some prudence when it comes to immigration, letting the problem fester and grow, and then coming up with a solution which takes us into sort of a fascist police state. And this is the danger of having these government databases, having the IRS, having the Homeland Security, because of the attacks of 9/11, people are willing to give up their freedom for security. And when, Benjamin Franklin says, if you give up your freedom for security, you're going to wind up with neither. And I think the airports where we're all turned into criminals in violation of our Fourth Amendment rights. We're all presumed to be guilty of a possible terrorist act on an airplane. And I find it, and I wrote about this a couple of years ago, this reminds me of Nazi Germany, where you can't go about your business peacefully, but the government presumes that you're an enemy of the people or an enemy of the state, which is a communist concept. If you're an enemy of Washington, or at least you're critical of Washington, you now become suspect in the eyes of the IRS. And leftists who were very critical of government when the Republicans were in power, but when they were in power, it seems that everything is okay to do to the American people.
right. And it seems to be that both parties, but especially with immigration, the liberals kind of let everybody in the country, and the conservatives say, well, we'll take the ones that are good for business.
Again, both sides are, the big issue there, I think, and I'll never admit to it, is Social Security. Basically, they have been embezzling the U.S. taxpayer dollars for the last 30, 40 years. They've gotten to the point where the well is dry. Now they suddenly have to come up with extra dollars to make sure that they can continue to pay the seniors, who, by the way, I think they're more afraid of senior citizens than any other group in this country. So what they both realize is if they want to get their butt reelected, they've got to keep the well.
But I didn't mean to
Right,
correct
Sure,
you,
no,
but
by all
you're
means.
suggesting that they see these new immigrants as net suppliers of dollars. Now, according to the Heritage Foundation, that famous dollar figure they
right.
came up, where you look at the inputs
Right.
and the outputs.
No, I think they're just thinking payroll tax. All they're thinking about is kick the can down the road to save themselves for the next couple of elections, so then when
Right,
they
right,
retire
right.
from Congress, they will not be blamed when everything goes to pot.
Right,
Well,
right.
That's
that-
if those people are in productive jobs I mean, what boggles the mind.
Remember, they want to increase the number of IRS agents. I think that's all part of
Well,
it. And that ties into the other
Right,
problem with
and-
the IRS
Go ahead,
scandal.
Dr. Uribe, go
Well,
ahead.
I mean, what I would say is, I mean, they both hit on interesting points, and I'll add another one is that, you know, unfortunately now we're looking at a system that has been broken by both parties. And I've always said this to my students or any colleagues of mine, that immigration really is not going to be addressed by either party. And when we talk about bipartisan effort, we're talking about coming to the table and being very realistic about what are the goals here. Whether it's about supplementing Social Security, which again, on face value is a wonderful system back when it was developed, you know, 70-something years ago. But again, when we look at exponentially how our population has grown, we've seen the lifespan of people grow also. The problem with this is that we're having a population, and again, and we're all sort of sons of immigrants somehow. You know, I'm a first-generation American. My parents came here legally. They did everything the right way, but we understand that not everybody does that. And you know,
Right.
and when we look at the system now, we look at something that has no signs whatsoever of being repaired anytime soon. And again, it's a typical political softball. It's just thrown around from either party to party or term to term, and you know,
And they use it as a game player to
well, I
get
think
reelected.
some congressmen and senators try to wash their hands of it, or at least for the most part, try to put a Band-Aid on a puncture wound. And you can't do that. There's no way you can do that.
I think that's
Go ahead.
why they use terms like immigration reform. Reform could be anything from putting up an electric fence and have no immigration to letting everyone in. And they could both be called reform. What they're really talking about is immigration liberalization. They're expanding the pool of immigrants. I mean, that's what they're doing, but they don't call it that. And it seems that there's a reason that they're obfuscating what they're doing, because if you couch some of those poll questions, for instance, do you want 11 million new workers in the United States? What do you think the results would be on those polls? I mean, as opposed to asking people,
Right.
are you in favor of naturalizing immigrants who are here by birth? You know, So I think that they really, I would like to ask them just a basic question. What is the goal of an immigration policy? What is the goal of immigration? Do we need it? Are we saying we're having immigration because we can't control the borders? Well, that's a sorry admission from my point of view.
Right.
They would
But if
have to
that's the
admit,
reason,
surrender.
Right,
We
right.
would
at
have to
least-
admit defeat.
At least admit it to us that that's
Right.
why
Right.
you're doing this. You're doing it because you can't control
right,
the
and
situation.
also, I think most people do want immigrants to come, but they want them to come the right way.
Yeah.
My big problem
Well, at
is
least
we have
legally.
11 million according to most
That's larger, by
estimates.
the way. It's
Right.
definitely
Oh.
larger. Let's be
But
honest.
11, 15, whatever. But the point is, the practical aside, how would we round up 11 to 15 million people and deport them? What the professor just said, I agree with. Basically, they will not surrender. Me personally, I think what we have to admit is, hey, you guys beat us. We were not paying attention. We were asleep at the wheel. You guys snuck in. Now, though, the rules are going to change. So
Right.
now we're going to get control of our borders. Then we're going to find out who is in this country. And then, to me, we can start talking about what we will do with the 11 to 15 million. But until we get control of our borders, it doesn't matter what immigration laws they pass.
I mean, but to his
Right,
point, I
right.
mean,
Go ahead.
how do we control borders? Do we put the military there? Do we put a fence?
That's where the big argument. I
that-
agree.
that's a
That's
debate
what
then.
the argument. That's what the discussion
Right.
should be right now. The
Right.
rest of it doesn't mean anything until we decide
But I'd
that.
like them to at least admit that they believe
Right,
that we
right.
cannot control our own
Right.
borders, which
Right.
is kind of a scary conclusion to come to, because that would mean
That they're
God help us,
incompetent.
that if
They're
Mexico
incompetent.
fell under, I don't know, some
Right.
foreign hands,
okay.
that we literally could not prevent.
I'm sorry, finish your point,
We
but I
could
gotta
not.
wrap
We
up.
could not prevent an invasion. Is that what we're saying?
I wish you would. It's
Right,
like
right.
being an alcoholic. They say the first part is to admit you're an alcoholic. Let's admit we blew it.
Okay, I'd like to thank our panel for joining us today, Dr. Sabrin, Dave Corsi, Dr. Zay, and Dr. Uribe. And I'd like to thank our viewers for watching us tonight. And just go on to YouTube and look on our channel, Liberty Action Network TV, and you can watch all of our TV shows.